Okay, today we're going to cover psychological disorders, and I'll start out with a brief definition of mental illness and insanity, and I'm going to look at it from a legal framework, which is very, very different from a psychological framework. And next, we'll move right into the major disorders and into personality disorders. The legal definition of insanity is known as the M'Naughton or McNaughton law in many states. And the law does differ a little bit from state to state, but in general, insanity is legally defined as an inability to know the difference from right or wrong. And so, although there's a stereotype that it's used a lot inappropriately, in reality, only a tiny percentage of cases where people try to use the insanity defense actually prevail. All you have to do to show someone is not legally insane is to show that they're lying or they cover up evidence. So it's really harder to meet than you might realize. In terms of psychological disorders, we're going to look at it from what's called a biopsychosocial approach, easy for me to say, biopsychosocial, and that just means we're going to consider biological, psychological, and social factors. All of these, as you can see from the diagram, tend to influence disorders. And these disorders, major disorders, are clinically significant, which means they cause significant problems in the way the person thinks or sees the world, and usually causes problems in relationships with others at work and personal life. The DSM-5 is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, and it's used to diagnose major mental disorders. Okay, so what I'm going to do is just kind of tell you the major disorders, and then we'll dig into them in more detail. So don't worry about writing these down as I say them right now. The first is anxiety and panic, then trauma and stress-related disorders, then obsessive compulsive disorders, depressive disorders, bipolar and related disorders, dissociative disorders, schizophrenia, and psychotic disorders, and this is going to be discussed in the module that goes along with this clinical chapter. So let's dig into more detail with these major disorders. Anxiety and panic disorders include generalized anxiety disorder. And as the first word generalized implies, this kind of anxiety disorder is often thought of as free-floating anxiety. It's anxiety that's not tied to a particular event. And so the person's really plagued with anxiety that just doesn't lift. In general anxiety disorder, then, as contrasted to other anxiety disorders, it is general, not tied to an event. Panic disorder is another anxiety and panic disorder, and panic disorder as a subcategory is characterized by panic attacks. And these attacks actually feel a lot like heart attacks. The person's heart races, they may feel dizzy or faint. And it is a really true physiological experience. They're not just thinking that their heart's racing, it really is. So it's a scary experience. And the person having one tends to think that it's lasting a long time, but it really just takes a minute or two, typically. If you go to YouTube and type in panic attack on live television, it'll take you to a link of a famous newscaster who had an attack on live TV, and as you listen to him, pay attention to how he viewed himself. He's really hard on himself, and the panic attack, at least from my perspective, doesn't look nearly as bad as he thinks it did. Phobias are the third subcategory under anxiety and panic disorders, and these are very intense fears of situations or objects. So it could be general, like a fear of heights, or it could be specific, like a fear of spiders. Trauma and stressor-related disorders are the second major category that we'll talk about, and this includes post-traumatic stress disorder. And this occurs from some kind of uncontrollable, unpredictable danger, which could range from being in a natural disaster like a flood or tornado, to coming back from wartime, to being violated by rape. All of these things share in common that there's unpredictable, uncontrollable danger, and all have the potential to produce PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder. Symptoms include re-experiencing the event, which is accompanied by increased arousal. And when I say re-experiencing it, it's not just remembering it, it's as if the event is actually happening to you, so it's terrifying. Psychic numbing just means that when they're not re-experiencing this event, you don't see the kind of normal emotional highs and lows you might expect from a person. Obsessive compulsive disorder is a third major category, and this really, OCD or obsessive compulsive disorder, really has two pieces. One is the obsession, which is a recurring thought or idea, and unfortunately these tend to be negative and often involve recurring fears of contamination or sickness to the self or someone you love. And the compulsion is an urge to carry out an act or an action sequence, a sequence of behaviors. So it could simply be like turning doorknobs. It could be turning doorknobs, walking down halls. It could be moving objects in specific places. And it's important to realize the person suffering from OCD realizes these rituals look bizarre and to other people, but it does help control the anxiety. We think that OCD may come from overactivity in the frontal cortex, which instead of dampening signals of fear that reach the cortex, they're not really modulated. In fact, they may be amplified. As an example, you can go to YouTube and type in A&E TV clip from Obsessed El Camino, and it will take you to a real-life case study of a young man who had unfortunately, many obsessions about harm and contamination that were triggered by certain objects. And the compulsions range from hand washing to the way he even stood when he brushed his teeth. So this little clip will tell you more than I could. And again, it's A&E TV clip from Obsessed, El Camino. The next major category, the fourth one, is depressive disorders, and this includes major depression. I'm going to put the profile of some of the symptoms up here. The emotional symptoms include thoughts of death, tearfulness, and apathy. And whenever somebody talks to you about suicide, you should always contact police, whether campus police or police in your area, because contrary to the stereotype, when people talk about suicide, they actually are statistically more likely to try to kill themselves. So it's extremely important that you take that kind of discussion seriously. Behaviors include apathy, which just means you don't really care about anything, and often extreme fatigue. The person may not want to go out anymore like they usually did. They may want to just stay in all the time. In terms of physical changes, there are changes in eating and sleeping, which can increase or decrease. The most common is a decrease in eating and an increase in sleeping, where they just don't feel like getting out. Correlates of depression include low norepinephrine and low serotonin. And basically, low norepinephrine and low serotonin are correlates of depression, and when we treat depression, we raise norepinephrine and or serotonin. One of the better short clips on depression you can go to by going to the Today Show website, which is today.com, and then type in video/teens TED Talk on depression goes viral. You can also just go to TED Talks and type in Teens Talk on Depression, and it's a really great short video on what the young man experienced during depression. Depression is not the same as just feeling down. The severity of it is worse than just feeling down, and it lasts longer. So not to be confused with just kind of going through a bad time and then bouncing back. We do know women are diagnosed twice as much with depression than men. Fifth category is bipolar disorders. Bipolar means an alternation of two poles. One is mania and one is depression. And of course, we just talked about the symptoms of depression. So what is manic depression or bipolar disorder? It has to include at least one episode of mania, which is a abnormally high state of exhilaration. When a person is manic, they feel all powerful, and they may do things that are totally, completely out of character, like go out and spend tons of money, stay up all night. They don't get tired the way a normal non-bipolar person would. And of course, this differs in terms of severity and degree. Correlates of bipolar disorder from a biological standpoint include an excess of serotonin and norepinephrine. So, treatment of bipolar disorder will lower serotonin and norepinephrine. A wonderful case study by a celebrity who has successfully dealt with bipolar disorder can be found on YouTube. If you type in Catherine Zeta-Jones discusses her bipolar disorder, and that's spelled Catherine, Catherine Zeta, Zeta hyphen Jones, discusses her bipolar disorder. And she's a wonderful example of how, with proper medication and therapy, bipolar disorder can be managed. Dissociative disorders are the sixth category, and these are so rare that most psychologists and clinicians and counselors, whether in social counseling or religious counseling, they never see an episode of these. Dissociative identity disorder, or DID, is the most common disorder. It's a true split or development of separate parts of personalities that alternate. Schizophrenia is the seventh major category, and you actually have a separate module on this, so I'll just briefly summarize the symptoms of schizophrenia. Delusions are false beliefs, and the person may have false beliefs that are bizarre. They may think they have superpowers. They may think, depending on the kind of schizophrenia, that they're being persecuted. Hallucinations are false sensory experiences. Disorganized speech and appropriate emotional responses are also typical. Read your module and pay attention to the positive and negative symptoms, and click on the link in that module, and it will show you how devastating untreated schizophrenia can be. Now we're going to move to a totally different topic. We're out of major disorders and we're moving into personality disorders. And these consist of three clusters, and you don't have to know the clusters for the exam. Cluster A is just kind of odd or eccentric, an example of schizoid, and I'll discuss that in more detail in just a minute. Cluster B is dramatic, emotional, and erratic or impulsive disorders like antisocial personality disorder, histrionic, and narcissistic disorders. And finally, cluster C is anxious, which includes things like avoidant personality disorders. And to differentiate these from the major disorders, although these do sound devastating and they can cause a lot of adjustment problems, in general the symptoms are not as extreme as the major disorders, and that's why they're in a separate category. Cluster A includes schizoid personality disorder, and this basically is typified by eccentric or odd behavior, not being just a little strange, but maybe having some belief systems that really seem out there. For instance, believing that UFOs are a part of normal life, but it could be that that's the only thing that the person ever believes or thinks about. And it could be something milder, like they just believe that people are generally really terrible and you have to be kind of careful and be super vigilant. So eccentric or odd belief systems or behavior are part of schizoid. Now, there are some examples of common personality disorders on YouTube, and probably the easiest way to get to those is just to type in cluster B personality disorders, and it'll take you to cluster B disorders, which we're going to talk about next. Cluster B disorders include antisocial personality disorder, or APD. Used to be called sociopath, used to be called psychopaths. And this includes a range of maladaptive behaviors. Sociopaths are generally quite manipulative. They may be able to function in society depending on whether they're physically or socially aggressive, because APD includes both socially and physically aggressive people in the same category. They share in common things like they have no conscience or morality, no matter how you define it. They don't have any physical response in terms of lying. They don't have any cognitions or thoughts about being bad if they do terrible things. They also don't show signs of anticipatory fear, and they don't show responses to fear in others. So, for instance, if I set you in front of a screen and I told you that I'm going to announce the numbers as they show on the screen 10 to 1, when it gets to 1, you're going to get a shock. As you hear my voice counting back from 10 to 1, for most people, they'll get nervous, their palms will sweat, their heart rate will increase, but we don't see that in sociopaths. Also, for normal people, if they're in the same room with someone who gets shocked when you reach the number 1, you show this kind of empathic response where your own pulse goes up even though you're not the one being shocked. We also don't see that response in sociopaths. They show a number of other unusual behaviors or anomalies. They process emotional words like love and hate at slower than normal speeds. For most of us, these emotional words are processed much more quickly than are non-emotional words, but not for the sociopath. They may be charming, but their connections are superficial, and they often take great pride in their ability to lie and manipulate. They see themselves as superior to others. They don't respond to punishment, as I noted a little earlier. Related disorders in this cluster include narcissism, which involves inflated importance and selfish behavior, and histrionic or overly dramatic behavior. So narcissistic and histrionic are two related disorders that also fall in cluster B. And again, if you want to listen to a video on those clusters from a different perspective, you can go to YouTube and just type in cluster B personality disorders. And finally, cluster C involves avoidant personality disorder, and this disorder involves mainly anxiety and sensitivity to rejection. So the person won't get involved with other people unless they feel very, very secure. As you might imagine, people in the avoidant cluster really suffer themselves. They're not causing pain to others, it's just their own life carries pain. That concludes the discussion on major and personality disorders, and I hope you enjoyed learning more about this area.